Hello guys, welcome back to our YouTube channel. In this video we are gonna see, what if Naruto was trained by Celestia and got harem? Part 3. If you want more awesome fan fiction like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. So without wasting any time, let's get into the video. The outcome to what was probably the most important battle in 1000 years turned in Equestria's favor as the force of good prevailed over the malevolent entity that possessed Princess Luna and purified the benevolent princess in a battle to end all battles. This was the truth that Celestia spread throughout her lands, as those that knew the truth kept quiet about what actually happened. It was a very hard day when she had to attend the summer sun celebration. When all of the true heroes were bedridden or asleep, she quelled a fear of their heroic citizens not returning with a quick lie of how they needed the smallest of checkups after such heroic acts. The crowd ate it up like she would devour a slice of cake. In other words, there was not a single doubt among them all. On that subject, she was brought to tears at the sight of the battle once she was arrived, her 3 prized students laying on the ground covered in grievous wounds that any pony lesser in their situation would die from. Her sister, to her surprise, was unconscious and covered in all sort of burns. Her teeth were gnarled as they looked as though they'd been kicked in repeatedly, and her tail was but a stub that barely covered her most modest of areas. She held only sorrow for not being the one to bear this burden. She quickly took each to Canterlot's hospital, hoping that despite her inactiveness to handle this matter, that they'd hold a fraction of respect for her compared to the respect she held for them. It had been a week since that fateful battle, and nearly every pony involved in the matter had recovered. Twilight's friends were easily let go from the hospital, as Celestia promised them that she'd summon them when their friend awoke, which she did not a few hours later, but was still bedridden for multiple reasons. Celestia had a long lengthy conversation with the 6 of them, commending them on stopping her sister, which they graciously took and casually disregarded, before getting to the subject at hand. They all voiced their concerns for Naruto and Sunset, mostly Naruto, but any conversations leading to him were reassured that he was fine, and that he was just sleeping off the few injuries he actually had. He wasn't, but they didn't need to know that. Their curiosity and their lengthy conversation over the 5 quickly left, leaving Twilight with a decision to make, and Celestia with a slightly larger problem on her hooves. That of her sister was starting to stir. Luna was the next one to wake up, 3 days later mind you, and that was a very long time to recover from their injuries, and while things went progressively well with Twilight, things didn't go too well with Luna. Celestia honestly believed that was because a unicorn had her mouth propped open and her horn near the mangled teeth of her beloved sister. Thankfully she was fully restrained, but it did little to reassure her younger sister as the unicorn's horn grew closer to her mouth. The process was difficult for the unicorn as she returned the alicorn's teeth back to its original state, which was a thankful miracle with all things considered. Celestia made haste to return to her sister's side, curious to what her thoughts on everything that transpired. The restraints were undone upon her arrival. They stared deeply at each other when she entered the room. Celestia was pleasantly surprised when Luna broke down in tears, uttering apology after apology. It took hours before their peaceful resolution ended, and any doubt of her sister's loyalty being in question erased from her mind as Luna took to her hooves, accepting whatever punishment came her way, which entirely depended on her 2 students. The next to wake up was Sunset Shimmer. She was unconscious for 4.5 days, which was 4 too many to the stubborn unicorn. Celestia could recall the sight of the mare biting into the nearest doctor and slamming her hooves into the nearest nurse that tried to stop her from leaving the room. Even her own arrival did nothing to sate the mare's fury as she insisted on finding Naruto. Her eyes brimmed with hatred as the orderlies pinned her down, blood coating her teeth as her injuries finally began to set in. An anesthetic had finally put her down as she promised to burn the hospital down if she didn't see Naruto. She had it bad for him. This was something the alicorn knew, so she supposed that she couldn't fault her for that. She adhered to the request. It wasn't even a matter, to be honest. Naruto was still unconscious and would remain so until he woke up, and she was sure of that. Celestia tried to stir up conversations with Sunset on the daily happenings of the hospital. Most were met with witty retorts that were about as harmful as a gentle breeze, others actually funny, including the one about the Pegasus that left a present for them, a coin by the looks of it. Conversations about Nightmare Moon brought a look of sorrow to the mare's eyes. The alicorn would hazard to guess the injuries sustained in such a brutal battle weighed heavily on her mind. She confided in Sunset, as she did too with Twilight and the others, and she would do for Naruto when he awoke. The enemy that they fought that night was her sister. Celestia expected a look of shock or surprise from the mare, only to find that ever-present knowing look, like she figured out the answer a while back. It wasn't until the 7th day that all fears were erased from Sunset and herself. Cerulean eyes opened, and perhaps the second most important conversation she had with Naruto would begin. Cerulean eyes blinked in confusion as the tiled white ceiling swarmed his vision. The smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils, and the occasional beat of a heart monitor gave him the unsatisfactory answer that he was in a hospital. He slowly rose from his uncomfortable pillow, finding the sight of Celestia smiling in front of him, a pile of gifts that H presumed was for him, and a relieved and tired-looking Sunset to his left. It was slightly odd though that a purple alicorn looked at him with a look of shame and what could possibly be fear. So we won, right? Naruto bit his jaw wondering the thought. He remembered defeating whatever that thing was and passing out, but he wasn't sure if something else happened. Yes, we won, idiot. Sheesh, nothing else happened, but Celestia showed up after you blew that thing to Tartarus and back, but on the bad side you missed a week. Sunset said with huff as she seemingly ignored the mysterious alicorn. Oh, stop with the glare, it wasn't intimidating when I yelled at Celestia before and it's even less intimidating now. The alicorn huffed, turning away muttering to herself. So who's she? Naruto asked, trying to change the subject. I'm glad you asked, Naruto, this my sister Princess Luna. Celestia could only smirk as Naruto's face shifted to various versions. It was a bit humorous. She was also Nightmare Moon before twilight separated her from that creature. The reaction wasn't surprising as Naruto visibly stiffened at the mention of Nightmare Moon. She was grateful at the show of restraint Naruto held as he stared at her sister, anger now evident in his eyes. I'm sorry. Luna's voice was quiet as the alicorn stepped forward, her eyes trained on the ground as she moved closer to Naruto, ready to accept anything he deemed worthy as punishment for her. 'Twas not my intention for this altercation to go as far as it did, that witching wisp might have been influencing my actions, but your injuries are still my own doing. She raised her gaze meeting Naruto's eyes expecting seething hatred and possibly his hoof coming crashing down on her face. It's fine, water under the bridge, Naruto grinned as he watched Luna's eyes water, tears threatening to slip down her face. She hugged the recovering alicorn, fighting back the tears that threatened to come. He turned his attention toward Sunset as she had a look of contemplation looking at each of him. Celestia however was smiling at the display, but something was off with the smile, like she had a secret she was waiting to reveal to him just at the right time. You're not telling me everything, are you? The words came out lighter than expected, despite the heavy implications behind it, and as the smile faded from Celestia's face, a wave of unease fell on Naruto as Luna pulled away the alicorn, returning to her sister with bloodshot eyes. You're correct, I wish you weren't bedridden as you were, but if I delayed this conversation, I honestly don't know what the repercussions might be, and if this past week has taught me anything it's that hesitance will only bring disaster to our land. Celestia's tone was darker than usual as her horn lit up, a flash of yellow magic spread throughout the room as 6 objects hovered before him. Do you know what this is, Naruto? Naruto stared blankly at the objects that hovered in the air, a sense of familiarity washed over him as he looked at the purple, green, blue, red and yellow shards of crystal. These were the remaining fragments of the element of harmony. The odd thing was the golden crown in front of him. It had his cutie mark as the headpiece, but it was an orange crystal swirl instead of the red one he had on his flank. I know those are pieces of the elements of harmony, but I have no idea what the crown is for. Are you making me a prince or something? He paled at the thought. His life in Canterlot was partially stuffy as it is, and if he became a prince, he didn't want to imagine the things he would have to do to get a moment's freedom. That's the element of magic, Naruto, or at least I believe half of it. Celestia watched as Naruto blinked, and then again and then a few more times for good measure. It would be seconds before he erupted. Wait, what? Naruto exclaimed as he shook his head back and forth, not accepting the likely scenario taking place right now. I believe you had me the first time, Naruto. This is your element of harmony, and as I said before, I believe that this is the element of magic. Celestia's voice was controlled and collected, that demanded him to at least her out before disclaiming her theory outright. I know you're implying that I'm the element of magic, but Sunset and I can vouch that we saw Twilight blast Luna with the rainbow magic and separated the two of them. She figured out the elements of harmony, not me, so go take the crown to her. Naruto eyed Celestia. The princess smiled and shook her head as she dropped the crown on his hospital bed. She figured out the elements of harmony, that is true, but I believe she wasn't the only that tried to find the spark. Sunset, Luna add Twilight herself, recall you using magic alongside her to try and activate the elements before they were shattered. Celestia watched as Luna looked away, rubbing the back of her head sheepishly at what her elder sister just mentioned. I believe that they reacted to both magical influences before their destruction, and in very different ways. Twilight herself felt a pride in finding friends that would stand beside her, and with that she genuinely opened up and accepted friendship. I want to say that this is the likely reason that Luna and the Frightmare were disconnected, all because she was more inclined to accept friendship. Celestia finished as Sunset looked away, finding the response feasible, but still not compelling enough to agree with, and apparently Naruto too, if the look on his face was anything to go by. That still doesn't explain why he's an element of harmony. All you basically said was that the new friendships that Twilight made spared Luna from being put back on the moon. Sunset said with pitiable tone as each set of eyes turned towards her. Celestia turned her gaze back towards Naruto, finding him still wary of this conversation. Exactly, so Naruto, what did you feel when you stared down that frightmare? Celestia asked as the gazes returned to Naruto, each curious about his answer. Celestia had a pretty good guess at what it was. Naruto blinked, thinking on the subject, the battle played before him, his mistakes, the things that he could have done, what he should have done and what he inevitably did do. There was one thought present in his mind as they traded blows: he needed to protect everyone. Nightmare Moon was going to harm a lot of his friends, ponies that he considered family, and so many ponies that did nothing wrong to deserve a life of eternal darkness, no matter how long it may be. I wanted to protect every pony, not just Sunset, Twilight and every pony else at the castle. Every pony. I made so many friends already, and it seems like a waste to lose them all because one alicorn had a bone to pick with the world for not enjoying the night. Luna looked away at the sincerity of the statement, the words stung with truth. Sisha smiled, her ears perking at the sincerity of his statement as he stopped looking right at her. That's why I believe it chose you, Naruto. The difference between you and Twilight regarding the elements of harmony wasn't accepting something that every living thing should have, nor was it a life-altering change of views and accepting others into your life. No, I personally believe that you knew about how precious friendship was from the beginning, and instead it reacted to your will to preserve those bonds you created, especially when you were going as far as putting your life on the line, when it mattered the most to preserve those bonds. Celestia finished as Naruto slowly started to accept the role as an element of harmony. However, you are just one element, and there are 5 mares unaccounted for, so please take these fragments with you until you find the remaining elements. Celestia said as she plucked the crown from the bed, leaving Naruto the 5 broken fragments. Naruto could only shake his head, grabbing the largest shard he could find. It's 4 princes, 4 mares I have to find. Naruto said as he pulled himself from the bed, his 3 hooves touching the ground as he walked on wobbly legs toward Sunset's bed, the task more difficult with carrying the item in his hoof. The mare shifted from a pensive stare to a surprised look as he placed the red crystal firmly in her hooves. The reaction to whether it was Sunset's loyalty or Naruto's conviction was instantaneous. It glowed for the slightest of the seconds before wrapping a necklace formed around her neck, with a red sun as the centerpiece. I mean, if Sunset wasn't my element of loyalty, I wouldn't know who could be. Naruto said nothing as tears streamed down his closest friend's face, not believing it was possible. The click of her necklace being detached was the only motion that Celestia at the miraculous feat that happened in a dingy hospital room, and without saying a word she left, her sister following closely behind her. Was you that said that the elements bearers chosen through harrowing deals or gargantuan feats, dear sister? Luna's voice a whisper as Celestia stopped to look at her, a knowing smirk written across her face. I believe Sunset had already accomplished both of those, don't you? Her words were soft as the underlying message was plain as day. She fought you alongside him, and that's not counting the few adventures that she drug him to do with her before your arrival. If Sunset wasn't Naruto's element of loyalty, the only other element I could find even remotely close to the mare's nature would be kindness. You jest. Luna's royal voice boomed through the hospital as orderlies, patients, nurses and a few doctors stared at her in confusion, eliciting a sheepish look from her, before quickly turning into a scowl directed at Celestia. We enjoyed jolly quips and pranks of the jovial kind. This, however, isn't something to be humorous about. That mare has the tongue of a viper and twice the venom. I see no justification of her being such an element. The scowl continued as Luna finished. If Celestia was fazed by it, she was hiding it rather well. Luna, my dear sister, I know Sunset so well, it was if she were a daughter to me. The mare is, as you said, as sharp-tongued as they come, but beneath that cold prickly exterior is a mare with a heart of gold, which only shows for the slightest of moments. I should know after all, I helped come this far after all. Celestia continues onward, exiting the hospital as ponies gave Luna and herself courteous bows, and with a quick nod wave of her hoof, they all continued on their day. Luna, I may not know what the future holds for Equestria, but I do know a thing or two about my students, and can tell you this, that even though I didn't foresee Naruto becoming a bear, but I knew that regardless of what happened that those 2 ponies would be together until the end of their days. Celestia gave one last glance at Luna as she winked at her before teleporting away, back to the castle, and to hide away Naruto's elements and give her sister some time to contemplate what he said. 2.5 days later. Naruto tried his hardest to keep a grin from forming on his face, soaking in what he called freedom from his imprisonment stay in the hospital. He stretched his hooves, letting his joints crack at the simple freedom to do whatever he felt like, causing his saddlebags shifting uncomfortably against his sides, the contents rattled back and forth. Some doctors and one nurse by the name of Tenderheart insisted on him staying to fully recover, but once he could sprint through the hospital without doubling over in pain, that was all the incentive he needed to leave the abominable place. It was admittedly hard leaving Sunset alone there in the dingy place alone, but the mare insisted on having a little time alone. It was weird she had gotten quieter after finding out she was an element. Maybe this was a big deal after all. His eyes glanced upwards at the night sky, it seemed more vibrant than before, like it had come alive. Naruto was willing to wager that it was because Luna was actually looking over the night once again. Celestia, while great and no doubt powerful, could only do so much, and watching over the constant night was probably something the mare could keep control over, but it was best left in the hands of the mare, who had originally done it so long ago, if not under a watchful eye. He walked with a slow gait, mindlessly avoiding the crowds as he headed towards Canterlot Castle. The ivory walls shined brighter than before with the luminescent moonlight pouring down it, illuminating any of the previous hiding places Pegasi of the Night Watch. He gave them a curt wave, which was returned with a scowl or dismissal of it, which practically meant to get to bed, we're working diligently to protect your sorry flank. Which he did, albeit with a quicker pace, he hadn't slept in his bed in what felt like forever. His hooves clacked against the ground as he galloped through the hallway, not so gracefully dodging the occasional Night Watch unicorn that glared at him as he passed him by. His hooves finally slowed down as the familiar sight of orange coming into sight. The door to his room was one of the noticeable doors in the area, it was an orange-painted door that contrasted with the pristine white walls that surrounded it, with the occasional gold trim close to the ground. Naruto unlocked the door and let it swing open with a satisfying silence, his Spartan-like room full with gifts that he really had no idea to do with, partially grateful that he had a clone bring all this stuff here earlier. He glanced at the card saying thanks or wishing him to get well soon, a rather large wicker basket of apples set nicely on his chair, obviously from the apple family or perhaps just Applejack, he wasn't entirely sure at the moment. This alongside a well-made blue scarf probably made by Rarity, and a book titled Practical Magic for the Magically Impaired. Which he imagined was from Twilight and possibly Spike. The more frugal gifts were a Jack-in-the-Box form Pinkie Pie, a autographed photo of Rainbow Dash, a cup from Fluttershy, he knew this because of the assortment of birds on it. Other gifts felt alongside a few picture frames from Octavia for which he was grateful for, a set of Aviators form Spitfire, and a haul of junk that he had no interest in from other adoring ponies, which made him wonder how he was going to get rid of half of this stuff without offending any pony in general. His eyes traipsed over the gifts, finding something else that he overlooked, a strange pendant. It was triangular in shape with what seemed like an alicorn, with its wings outstretched and its head stuck in a defiant pose on top of it, or the upper half of one at least. Naruto had no idea what it was made of it, but what he could tell was that there was something missing from it, a large diamond-like shaped hole in the center of it, there was a much smaller hole where its eye was, but it seemed insignificant to the item. Naruto glanced at the object for a few moments longer before placing it in his saddlebag that contained the pieces of the elements of harmony. He'd look at it or show some pony tomorrow, right now that wonderful and expensive Cloudsdale Cloudbed was calling his name. He made on more pass with his magic, a clone appearing from nowhere with an all-too-familiar scowl on his face. Just watch them, those things are important after all. His words were tired but forceful as the clone looked towards the saddlebag complying to its creator's command. It wasn't long after Naruto's head hit the fluffy and shiny goodness of his bed and falling off to dreamland. The cloaked figure made its way through Canterlot Castle, expertly dodging the guards and remaining unseen to any of the ponies that were moving about at this late of night. It was years of practice that made it so she could slip past the security and head towards her intended destination. Magenta eyes stared intently at the orange door, it was a rather irritating sight compared to the pristine castle that she had so stealthily infiltrated. Her hoof clasped on the doorknob, slowly twisting it open, it swung open with silence as she gazed into the room. The figure held back a smirk as the open door did little to illuminate the room, leaving only the moon to illuminate it, and even the illustrious moon's light barely faded into the room, giving it the barest sense of visibility, something that she'd become accustomed to for a long time. Slowly her hoof took a small step forward, entering the room as her eyes fell on its occupant, an orange unicorn that just so happened to get the unlucky draw of her accidentally entering Harem during his recovery. She watched as his fellow irate roommate stared at her with questioning eyes, she inquired about her abrupt entry into the hospital room. It was only quick thinking that had saved her flank, claiming to give a present under the guise of the unicorn to get well soon. Her breath hitched as she put the piece of the alicorn amulet into the pile of gifts, hoping they weren't searching for the fabled relic or the grunts of her foe was looking for him. Thankfully they didn't know what it was, and even better the goon squad had no idea what she did. So she staked out the hospital waiting for the blonde to be let out and was impressed when he came out walking carrying the pile of junk right before into room earlier today. 3 days was a very fast recovery time for any pony in general, and it was seemingly impossible for a unicorn. So with a perfect excuse she waited until the figure disappeared from his room, possibly letting every pony know that he was alright. It was annoying and rather taxing to shift through all the collective gifts he received, but unfortunately it wasn't in the pile as she was hoping for. Thoughts plagued her mind as multiple possibilities of her desperate gambit not paying off, letting the alicorn amulet slip away from her, none of them were good. Her fears were somewhat alleviated as the blonde came out of the hospital grinning with a saddlebag. It had to be in that bag, and unfortunately the only way she was going to see its contents were if she was to slip in while he was asleep. So here she was standing before the saddlebag with hopefully the piece of the alicorn amulet, the target fast asleep, but still something still rang out as dangerous in her mind, and only years of reacting to the slightest hint of danger saved her from having her head caved in from another pony's hoof. The blow sounded off against the floor as the attacker lashed out with a kick with his hind hooves that didn't come close to touching her, while he was propped in an awkward position, standing on the one hoof alone, that attempted to deal such a devastating blow to her. He's good. It was a passing thought as he righted himself to standing on all four hooves, defiant blue eyes staring right back at her, and as she returned the stare. Patience wasn't clearly his strong suit as he rushed at her, possibly trying to end the battle with one decisive blow, only for each hoof he shot forward to be deftly avoided or deflected. It was only a matter of time before he overextended itself, leaving it open for a quick jab into the outstretched joint. A small crack could be heard as the assailant moved backwards trying to gain a defensive position, however she would have none of that. Her cloak flew upwards as a wing covered in metal sprung forth, blinding him from her movement, and it was too late for him to put up any guard to defend against her head smashed into his. The blow sent him careening backwards, and a quick flick of her wing sent metallic feathers shooting forward at the now losing assailant, getting him trip over his hind hooves, and with the speed of a Pegasus, she pressed the metallic wing against his throat. "Please don't make me do this, all I want is the amulet, and then I'll be on my way." Despite how vicious he fought and how close he came to killing her, she held no real qualms with him, so it shocked her to no end when he disappeared with a plume of smoke, but it shocked her a little more as a hoof came crashing down from above, smashing her head into the concrete below, softer than before, but still powerful and painful enough to knock her out. A small pool of blood dripped from the decisive blow as Naruto looked at the loser, quickly restraining her with the room's curtains after inspecting the metallic wing, which was no more than a weapon the Pugasi used for combat when aerial battles were a must. It was no hassle removing it as she lied limp on the floor. Now that the thief was restrained, he quickly returned to his previous task. This general location was ideal for any village in the country of Zebrica, as it was surrounded near a bountiful water supply and a rain forest that seemed to go on for miles with plenty of various fruits, flowers, bugs and fungi to live off of. It was a paradise for the small village of Zekru. However, this paradise was under attack. A blue light illuminated the night sky as the stench of smoke and burnt flesh filled the air. A few figures shrieked in pain as they desperately tried to put the flames out, rolling in the dirt, patting each other down. Nothing seemed to quell the flames, because the small bank of water they were near posed another problem, nearly as dangerous as the flames itself. It was only a matter of time, now that most had collapsed on the ground. It seemed not a single soul would survive the night if one were to look at the village at the moment, and with the forces conspiring against the small quaint village, it wasn't looking good for any villager today. The lone figure watched with a look of intrigue and disgust as charred corpses crackled on occasion and the wail of one of the elders roared from the water behind him. The zebra gasped as water filled his lungs, desperately pulling himself to the surface. The escape was short-lived as he was pulled back under. His flailing did nothing but sap his strength. "Where did you tell that zebra to take that piece of the amulet?" The figure's voice said with a cold, uncaring tone. Today he didn't feel too excited for torturing his enemy. It had to be one in particular to allow him to feel something akin to happiness, or perhaps something akin to a euphoric feeling. This old zebra was rather boring, even as he confronted him as the corpses of the young littered around him. The look of anger and fear almost brought a sinister. The fire in the zebra's eyes was however not matched by his skill in combat, and without moving an inch the chief had been defeated by the lone figure. "I'll never tell you." The zebra's words choked out as he found submerged under the water once again. His lungs tightened as he struggled to hold his breath, water slowly filling his throat. It wasn't long before he was choking on the water that he held so cherished so greatly not hours ago. He could feel the secret weapon of his opponent wrap around his neck, and with an audible snap it was over. The elder was now nothing more than another number to the body count. Whether he complied or not, his fate was almost already determined. "You're right, you won't," the figure said, uncaring as the body floated upwards, the current gently dragging the elder body downstream. The figure slowly moved his head to the forest, wondering if his partners was handling their part of the mission. His eyes slowly moved back toward the few figures that were still alive, approaching the river with a fevered pace, a frown forming on his face as the thought of cleaning his fur from the burn marks was going to be terribly inconvenient. Shadows danced across the jungle as the occasional snap of a branch erupted through the dense fauna. The very sound caused the figures to shift their direction, heading towards the cause of the sound. 17 sets of amber eyes illuminated through the darkness as their bodies charged through the jungle, each mouth opened with a snarl as they stopped at what they presumed was the location of their target. It was an empty clearing. Their eyes darted to each other as another snap echoed behind them and a hiss erupted from each of their throats, but each one refused to pounce on the target as it stepped calmly into the clearing. "She's not here, fan out and find him before she escapes this jungle," the figure said with an annoyed tone. Azure serpent-like eyes rolled as the biggest of the 17 figures stepped forward. The size difference between the two was staggering as the lone figure stood twice the creature's size. Despite the mismatch of height, its pearly white fangs were still bared towards the figure. They gleamed thanks to the occasional beam of moonlight. It was followed by another figure taking a step forward, and then eventually the whole group looked ready to bear down on the newcomer. 3,000 bits, that's how much your boss is going to make off this joint venture deal, and myself, well, I intend on making my boss happy, so how about we both cooperate for your sake? The creatures blinked in confusion as they took another step forward, not realizing the idle threat that was sent at them. "I guess I need to reinforce this lesson, don't I?" He was given nothing more than a growl as he lifted his clawed hand into the air. Its thumb set ablaze, getting the figures to back away, fully aware of what the flame would do to any of them if they were touched by it. The tainted night air filled his lungs as he blew onto the soul digit. A bullet of flame shot forward, wrapping itself around the smallest figure of the group. His hissed in pain for nearly 3 seconds before dropping to the ground dead. The look of fear was now present in the creature's eyes. A sense of demise filled each of their heads as they knew that this being would kill them if they didn't accomplish their goal. "Now go search for that zebra." The words promised pain for any failure on the now 16 figures' part. They all scattered into the rainforest as the figure stood alone. The sinister creature said nothing as his eyes traveled upwards, finding a defiant-looking zebra staring back at him with brown eyes. It impressively stood on its hind hooves, slightly larger than the largest of that idiotic crew he sent off. The large wooden spear rested on one front hoof as the other helped level him out on the tree branch. It was likely that she was hiding various other instruments to make his organs a decorative piece of the landscape. Speaking of decorative pieces, he couldn't help but twist his mouth into a sinister smile at the red gem hanging precariously around her neck. The second piece to the alicorn amulet was right before him. The serpent-like creature took a slow step forward to let the zebra know that it wasn't impressed by the show and intimidation it was pulling. "I wonder how long it would take for me to incinerate your body 1 inch at a time." He laughed as the spear came flying towards him, thrown with the intent to impale him on the spot. A quick pucker of his lips and a sharp whistle had a cylinder of flame erupting from the tips of both lips, swiftly turning the spear into ashes. The lack of sight quickly came to an end as the zebra wasn't where it once was, registering too late. The zebra that was nearly in hoof range let out a fearsome war cry as a curved blade swung from nowhere, slamming into the beast's body. The look of satisfaction slowly fell on the mare as it stared deeply at the place she struck. The blade was stuck between the beast's scales. It was a blow that easily ended the beast's life. Bravo, effective misdirection coupled with an intense attack that would kill a lesser creature. "Be still, my beating heart. If you were a drake, I'd think I'd force myself onto you by now, but alas, you're just a zebra, not a bad looking one at that, mind you. I'm just not into that interspecies thing," the drake said with such splendor, not even registering the blade that was set betwixt his scales. In fact, it seemed he was delighted in the fact that she dealt a blow on him, which was likely to be her last, as the azure eyes fell on her. "Also, your mechanism was wonderfully done, using your body posture to hide the blade as you used the hoof to settle yourself and the flick of your tail to activate the intended effect. Sheer genius. Since you actually dealt a blow against me, I guess it would be cordial to introduce myself to you. I am Fire Draka, the last of the fire drakes, and the last thing you'll see tonight." His voice was anything soothing as it lowered its clawed digits onto the blade, freeing itself from its confines before forcefully taking it from the zebra. His right claw grasped the zebra's throat tightly, bringing it to eye level with fire. The look of anger and fear was evident of the mare. Her eyes watered as death was all that was promised as she looked into its cold eyes. Each digit slowly began to rise in heat as his grip on her throat remained the same. Quickly she thrashed against the searing heat that threatened her. It was fruitless though, as his grip was that of a vice, and the patience of the psychotic drake wore thin as her head erupted in a ball of blue flame, leaving a headless zebra smoking, and the fabled piece of the alicorn amulet dropped on the ground between him and the smoking corpse. He never had a moment to reach for it as a figure darted past him with the object between its teeth, the accursed leader of that pack of animals. Another figure slowly walked into the clearing, his partner eyed this endeavor for the time being. "It seems that you came away rather unscathed, unfortunate in my honest opinion." He grinned maliciously at the figure as it stared at him without an ounce of fear. Perhaps this was the only out of the bumbling group here that would make him work for the gem. "You'll get the gem when I get my payment, Fire, and besides, it's useless without the other pieces." The figure chuckled at the thought of it being put together. "It would take centuries to find the last piece if you didn't know where it already was, that is." "I'm well aware of that, and I'm sure you know where the last 2 pieces are, don't you?" The words were surprisingly sane considering the earlier moment before. The moonlight finally shined down on an ebony dragon-like creature, about 10 foot in sheer size alone when standing straight. Its body was slender and covered in ebony-colored scales with nary one out of place. Tree trunk-like legs stood firmly planted on the ground, with 4 talons sprouting from each foot, 3 in the front and 1 in the back. Fyra's arms were gangly thin that coiled into loops as if it had no bones. This was slightly disturbing compared to its menacing snake-like face. Its azure eyes were twinkled with madness that seemed to set even his partner on edge. I might know of its whereabouts, but I don't sell information without turning some sort of profit. The figure clicked his tongue at the last word. His intentions were as plain as the genocide they committed not moments ago. Retrieve the last 2 pieces and I'll pay you 10 times the amount as this job. Fyra's words were clear as the deal was put on the table before him. 30,000 bits would put albeit a decent dent in his money pit, but it would be well worth it if this being could deliver what his boss had sought for so long. The years hadn't been kind to his master, and despite have such an able mind, he couldn't possibly remember everything, but this amulet would change all that, and then some. Do we have a deal? Why, I believe we do. In fact, some of my best workers are actually retrieving the piece that was so wrongfully stolen from me. The figure said with a laugh. And even if they don't bring it back, I'm sure the message will be loud and clear, and a wonderful meeting at the Alicorn's Eye will happen. The mysterious figure smiled as it turned to its companion. Obo, get the twins, I believe that they'll be of use to me real soon. Naruto had been staring at his prisoner for the last hour. The sun rising always woke him up by some way or form, unless he was recovering from life-threatening injuries, of course. This time wasn't well wasted, as he didn't pry and sneak a look at the mysterious Pegasus that had tried so hard to rob him. She possibly would have gotten away with it too if she wasn't so preoccupied with his clone. He fished out the trinket and set it on the ground before her. He wanted answers and he was going to get him today, so when the unconscious Pegasus began to stir, Naruto readied himself for something he tried to avoid: interrogation. Naruto ignored the glare being sent his way by his prisoner. Honestly, she should be happy she wasn't in a canterlit jail cell. He was much nicer than the inmates. So this amulet, is it valuable or something? It was the easiest idea that came to mind. She had no rightly idea what it was or its worth, besides the fact it was missing the most important, essentially the jewels. It's none of your business, she replied, blowing one of the few strands that was hung free from her cloak. I think it became my business when you tried stealing it from me, Naruto said as the thief cringed at the words, which was odd considering the profession she was in. I was just trying to get it back. I accidentally gave it to you, and all I'm doing is getting what's rightfully mine, the thief said with a quick snap, her eyes trying to plead to the unicorn's source of decency. She watched as his gaze softened, staring at her. It seemed he was considering what she was saying. Then why give it to me? Naruto said as he stared at her. He already decided what he was going to do. He just wanted a few more answers before he let her go. She was a good mare, just made a mistake, and he wasn't one to judge her on making this one mistake. Because I didn't have a choice at the time. You were a mistake, he watched as she mumbled something under her breath before returning to meet his curious stare. That amulet is bad news. Trust me when I say this, it's better that you give it to me and we go our separate ways. She said it with such conviction that as though she was speaking from experience. Things like this don't go away, unicorn. They might just stop annoying you for a while, but it'll return, it always does. She looked at him. His eyes seemed to understand what she was saying, but maybe it was wishful thinking on her part. I know. His words were quickly interrupted with a distinct Pegasus barging through the window. Knock. 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 Whoa, wait a minute now. I didn't think you had it in you, Naruto, and I especially didn't think that you were into that sort of thing, a yellow Pegasus said with a grin as she draped her wing over Naruto, who was choking on words trying to think of something. Spitfire, as in the captain of the Wanderbolt Spitfire. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Who did she give the amulet to? Yep, that is I, but the question is, what's your name? No, wait, I'm pretty sure. I don't want to know the name of the mare who Naruto ruts on a regular basis, Spitfire said with such ease that the 2 other occupants paled at the implications of what she just said. Look, Spitfire, you tell her, unicorn. She couldn't believe her ears. Shouldn't Spitfire be somewhat professional going through paperwork or commanding the Wanderbolts? It's Naruto, and secondly, we're not rutting, Spitfire. He didn't know whether to head back to bed and pretend like this never happened or head to Octavia's and wait until this past while conversation was long forgotten. So did you kidnap or are you holding her hostage? Because you know both isn't really a good idea, being in the castle, Spitfire said as Naruto looked at her, likely questioning the sanity of her and essentially the Wanderbolts. Fine, what did she do? You'd think he'd be appreciative of her spending time with him since the whole Nightmare Moon fiasco. Thankfully they saw her doing something during that incident as work and gave her a little more time off. She tried to steal from me. I beat and restrained her before going back to bed. Spitfire whistled as she looked down at the thief, tickling her nose with her wing, the mare desperately trying to bite her. Seriously, not even a day out of the hospital and already attracting trouble, it's like you have no off days. She said, her orange eyes eyeing the mare. She looked kind of familiar, but she'd seen many ponies. This could be just another one of those faces. So what are you going to do about her? Let her go, I guess. Naruto watched as Spitfire shrugged. The thief looked shocked at his admission, not entirely sure what to say to it. So she isn't going to rob you then? She might, I mean, I'm not giving her the object she came for. Naruto said as the looking downwards, magenta eyes stared intently, trying to tell him that is a horrible idea. I know what I'm doing. Speaking of knowing, don't you think she looks familiar, Naruto? I can't put my hoof on it, but it's like I've seen this mare once or twice before. Spitfire said, getting a shake from Naruto's head. Look, please give it back to me. If it helps, my name is Daring Do, and with those two words her very name had changed the situation. A simple introduction silenced the room, a wave of unease washing over the restrained Pegasus that had just revealed one of the biggest secrets in her short life so far. Daring hoped that they'd take the words to heart and perhaps do as she asked. This whole fiasco did nothing to assuage her fears of being caught by something other than a unicorn skilled in hoof-to-hoof combat. Her throat tightened as Spitfire's interest seemed to have left the topic of her being Daring Do and focusing on something else, which made her hopes pin on Naruto, who looked internally debating with himself if his contorting facial expressions were anything to go by. Naruto couldn't decide if this was possibly one of the coolest things to happen to him or saddened that Daring Do, the mare whose books he read twice, was trying to rob him because she made a mistake. He didn't necessarily believe her when she introduced herself as Daring Do, but the look in her eyes swayed him. It was an easy way for him to tell that she felt conflicted, telling them that she was the famed treasure hunter, and while he didn't know what Spitfires thought of the mare, he knew he could trust her to an extent, even if seemed she hadn't told him everything about the amulet yet. Spitfire, do you mind releasing her? Naruto asked as Daring's magenta eyes stared on at him, questioning his intentions. I'm not too big on this idea, but it's not my room. Sunset said as she leaned down to free the Pegasus. It was only a matter of seconds before Daring Do rose to her hooves, freed from the curtain that was used as a restraint. Naruto didn't know how to feel about the mare that tried to rob him, but he was pretty sure she looked the part. The grayscale hair that started at black and then steadily reduced itself to lighter shades of the color until it stopped on an even gray. The light gold wing flopped out, stretching to getting used to its newly found freedom. As the mare slowly stretched before them, the idea starting to look clearly like the Pegasus. The other wing, however, was heavily bandaged as she kept it tucked next to her barrel. She didn't have the trademark khaki jacket that he expected seeing from reading the stories, nor the pit helm either, but he could brush those off as something that would possibly draw more attention to her as she tried to infiltrate the castle. His eyes dropped to her flank, ignoring the stare in his peripheral that she sent his way. It was exactly as the book portrayed, a compass of sorts rested on her flank. Thank you, I'm glad to see you understood the gravity of the situation. I'll just take that and be on my way. Her wing froze as it tried to reach for the piece of the amulet, an orange hoof pinning it down, her eyes meeting an unamused Naruto as he forcefully made it retract or face a crippling injury for any Pegasus. I thought that meant. I let you go. I never said take my stuff. Now can we talk about this thing and some other important things too? What do you want to know? Daring said, gauging the blonde. Okay, first, why is Daring Do, if you are her, trying to rob me? Last time I checked she was one of the good guys, you know, purveyor of justice and stuff. Naruto said as he recalled her first book and all the deeds she did along the way of thwarting a Huizitl at every turn in the story. I am Daring Do, and I'm robbing you because I thought it was going to be much easier than this. Daring said with a huff as she looked away. What is so important about this stupid thing? Naruto asked as the Wonderbolt captain leaned over him, sneaking a few glances at the Alicorn amulet. It's called the Alicorn amulet and is nothing but trouble. It drives all of the people that adorn it insane. History has proven that time and time again. Daring Do spoke with reverence as she eyed the amulet. This thing destroyed loves when it was complete and in the wrong hooves, so if I get it incomplete, I'm going to stow it away to somewhere that nobody would ever find it. Her tone shifted to one of resolution as if she so vehemently believed the words she spoke. Do you even know where to find another piece to it? Spitfire asked with curiosity on the subject, not particularly believing the Pegasus. No, but I know someone in Rome that does. If any pony needed information, he'd be the pony to go to. Spitfire, do you want to go to Rome with me? Naruto said as he watched the Pegasus grin at the question. The answer was plain as day on her face. You seriously can't mean to be going there just because I told you about my contact. Daring protested as she restrained herself from yelling at the unicorn that was now leaving the room. Where are you going? Nope, he's already made up his mind, and I for one can't think of a better way of spending my vacation time. Spitfire said as she grinned at the mare. It was obvious that this whole situation irritated the adventurer to no end. And he's going to tell his friends he's going to be gone for a while. Speaking of which, we should go tell your friend that we're coming. The words are more of a request than a demand as the adventurer huffed to herself, finding that this next book was going to be more of a headache than she hoped for. Ering said nothing as she filled out the letter, Spitfire sending the occasional glance her way, curious to what she was writing down, and each time she was caught she'd just turn away whistling. It was a small request from a contact she knew. He owed her for the nuggets of information that she'd given to him to start his little business, so any information on the amulet that he had to give was definitely being let off easy in her honest opinion, and honestly, out of all the ponies on her relatively short list of contacts, he was probably the best source of information that she knew. And the most hands-on out of them all as well. The showboat was always up for an adventure if the mood suited him, but he would never shaft her. Loyalty was a big thing between the two of them, especially in both of their line of businesses, especially since they heavily relied on one another for a source of income. We're finished here, let's get those tickets and go. Daring couldn't help but let out with a huff, if it wasn't for the fact that she knew she couldn't beat Naruto catching him off guard, and not wanting to test how she'd fare against a Wanderbolt in a fight she'd have tried knock them senseless and been halfway across Equestria by now. Spitfire held back a smirk as she watched the rather uptight mare look off into distance while minding the crowd. If nothing else, the Pegasus had a rather great sense of avoiding ponies and being ignored in general. So how long do you think it'll take for your friend to get it? Spitfire asked with a sense of curiosity. She hadn't really been too keen on the idea that Daring Do was walking next to her. It could be true, but it might have been a lie as well. Either way, she'd find out. Daring's thoughts shifted from her esteemed contact to the question. It wasn't a matter of when, it was a matter of how long it'd be before he'd arrive. If in all honesty, she'd be surprised if he wasn't already on his way here. The letter was of high quality runes and cost quite an exuberant amount of bits that she could barely afford. The second it received a stamp from the postal service, she knew it had arrived at the intended destination. He's already got it, it's just a matter of how long he'll wait for us and how he'll react to two ponies he'd never met before, especially since he's the cautious type. Spitfire rolled her eyes as she looked absently through the crowd, a strange figure towering over the city's locals. Is that a minotaur? The question was innocent enough as the Pegasus found it hard to believe that such a beast would even come to a city as big as this. Most stuck to their own kind. Yeah, it is. Daring swallowed a lump in her throat as the figure's eyes locked onto her. A plume of air flew from his nostrils as he began coming towards them, and a sense of dread washed over her. We should start running. She recognized a familiar form of her rival's muscle. Minos was a minotaur that Daring had the unfortunate meeting with on separate occasions, and each meeting didn't fare well in her favor. Only her wings and quick thinking helped stop the hulking brute of a minotaur. Spitfire tilted her head at the looming figure coming towards her, and Daring Do, a look of perhaps fear and uncertainty, rang in her fellow companions' eyes as the figure moved towards them. The crowd of Canterlot was partially ignoring the hulking minotaur coming towards them, only moving out of the way as it took slow, meticulous steps towards them. It was kind of funny, in fact, as the creature walked on a single set of hooves and cracked his hands as he glared at her companion. He had muscle upon muscle that showed with its pink skin. Its large horns coated with a brown dusting that she could only assume was dried blood. The sight alone was about as intimidating as Soren after one of the Wanderbolt's more rigorous training sessions. I honestly don't see why we should. The guards could take care of him if he tries anything, and besides, I can take him, he doesn't look too tough. Spitfire said absent-mindedly as she felt the wind slightly disrupt next to her, signifying the slow retreat of her companion. I advise you staying. I don't want to explain why to Naruto why I had to knock you unconscious, because you didn't want to face a minotaur. Her tone shifting from the usual jovial one to something much more serious as the minotaur stopped in front of them. I expected you to run, Daring. His voice was surprisingly high, which caused a fit of giggles to erupt from Spitfire, her orange eyes full of mirth, as she laughed at the minotaur's expense. And what are you laughing at? Mino said as he plucked the aviators from the Pegasus, meeting her mirthful eyes. Daring said nothing as the mare next to her finally stopped laughing. The orange eyes had changed from being full of mirth to something more playful. Can I have my aviators back? Daring cringed as the glasses crackled in the minotaur's palm, a sneer forming on its face as it dropped it to the ground in front of the captain of the Wanderbolts. She didn't know if the pair of glasses had any sentimental value to the Pegasus, but she now hoped that she understood the gravity of the situation. Oops. A high-pitched voice let out as he grinned at the look of shock and annoyance written on the Pegasus's face. Now run along, Pegasus, I have business to attend with this pony. It said with a grin, expecting the pony to be on its merry way. Spitfire bit her cheek as she stared at the crumpled aviators before her. That particular pair was 30 bits and came all the way from Cloudsdale, and if it wasn't enough already, to add insult to injury, she watched the minotaur shift its attention towards Daring, getting the Wanderbolt to pucker her lips in annoyance. She could overlook the destroyed aviators, technically she had it coming, but to ignore her completely when it was obvious that she was with the archaeologist was downright insulting. I have a question though for such a big strong minotaur such as yourself. Her words were filled with sweetness as he swayed at the sudden jerk of the minotaur's head. Let it be known that flattery worked on all forms of life. What is it? It attempted to say in a gruff voice that made it all that much funnier with its already high voice. Well, I myself was curious as to whether you're a male or female. I mean, if you're male, I'd imagine the insult never got leave her mouth as she flew into the post office, crashing through the window, red eyes staring on at her with utter hatred. The towering bovine human hybrid stretched as it took a step inside the post office, shattered glass breaking under hoof, not registering the yellow blur that passed by him, nursing her aching jaw. Sheesh, you'd think you'd answer a simple question. Do you have a small eye? Her orange eyes narrowed as Daring's hoof found its way into her mouth, not finding her question plaguing her mind like herself. Quit being so stupid. Daring couldn't believe how idiotic one of the most famed Wanderbolts was. It was almost gut-wrenching to think that ponies looked up to this mare. Spitfire quickly removed the hoof. Yeah, but I have one quick question. Every pony here saw that here, right? Me being hit. Spitfire's voice was low as she waited for any sort of gesture from the mare. She grinned at the small nod. It was all she really needed to let loose in public. The minotaur shifted in anger as it attempted to exit the building, his attempt cut short as the Wanderbolt came crashing into him, her hoof planting squarely across his forehead, sending him down into the broken glass. The crunch was barely audible over the screams that filled the post office, and the gasp for air was the only thing the minotaur could do as it failed at picking himself up. The irritating Pegasus now stood over him. The look of devil-may-care was gone, replaced with a more hardened look the minotaur wasn't expecting. Wow, you're awake after that. Orange eyes stared down at the recovering minotaur, her wings gesturing for him to get up, only to attempt an unsuccessful grab. His failed attempt was met swiftly with a hoof stamping on his stomach, eliciting bile to erupt from his mouth. Yeah, you're done. I'll get a guard to handle this. Spitfire's hoof shot out, slamming into the minotaur's face, eliciting a small groan of pain as its eyes reeled into the back of his head before hopping to the ground, knowing all that the crowd saw a blur of movement from the Pegasus before she slammed her hoof into the minotaur. Daring could only watch on in fascination and slight horror as one of her rival's strongest and most capable minions systematically get beaten by the Wanderbolt, and the way it seemed it looked like she was still taking it easy on him or her. If any doubts of the Pegasus lingered in her mind at the display of strength and speed by the Wanderbolt, it was long gone, especially with Naruto at her side. This was perhaps the first time Daring felt that she wasn't the underdog in the situation, that she was openly the one with a better hand to oppose him, and his motley crew, scraping by was fine, but succeeding outright was just rewarding in itself. Naruto attempted to glare at the Pegasus sitting next to him, attempting the keyword as one of his eyes was swollen shut, a large bleeding gash above the other one, and parts of his mane and coat had been partly burned. In short, his friends and teacher didn't take his departure too well. Someone got his flank handed to him. The sing-song tone of Spitfire did nothing to alleviate Naruto's mood. I don't understand, you said you'd be fine talking to your friends, you'd convince them that this was the good for Equestria. I don't think you should come with us in your injured state. Daring said as she looked on at the unicorn, not believing that his allies could do something of this nature to a friend of theirs, which was another reason that she didn't rely on others unless she bartered with them. It isn't that bad, I'll say by tonight I'd be looking much better, the eye still might be a little swollen though. Naruto said as he looked away, his hoof reaching for his swollen eye, immediately retracting at the slight touch, caused a ripple of pain through him. He seriously wondered if Celestia held back, because if so that was a bit of a scary thought, because his head was still rattling from that blow. Casually bringing up that he was leaving the country to go look for an amulet of mass destruction didn't go too well with her, and despite her insistence of him staying, he gave her a polite as can be no. Naruto honestly thought he was off the hook as he made his way out, only to receive a quick jab from the princess that made her stance on the subject quite clear. The gash from Octavia was merely cosmetic, she hit him good with the bow, and that was because he interrupted her, but when he told of her of what she was doing, she didn't attempt to sway him, only confiding in him to return home safely. Naruto suspected that Octavia knew that he was going to go with her without her blessing, it was just he wanted to confide in her. Sunset on the other hand, Naruto honestly was still kind of scared of seeing her anytime soon. The look she gave him when he told her was the stuff of nightmares. In fact, he felt ready to go another round with Nightmare Moon the way she's seething, and he was thankful that he got away with minor burns because she said she was going to use those fireballs rather creatively. And he was partially fond of all parts of his body, especially that which made him a stallion. That's impossible, no pony can heal that fast unless they were an earth pony. Nah, Naruto's like a super unicorn or something, I can vouch for that, and I know I've done worse to him. Spitfire smiled as she punched Naruto, earning a quick glare sent towards the Pegasus. Well, I still insist that he doesn't come, he's still recovering from the hospital, and I know that a Huizitl isn't a force to be taken lightly. He'll rip you apart with his bare hands if he gets a hold of you. she knew that was true from personal experience. Ahuizitl was a ruthless killer that cared much for any pony's life, as he cared for what the world thought of him, which was very little. Daring couldn't in good mind bring danger on the unicorn's head, even if he looked ready to take it head-on. She held herself responsible for a lot of things, and if she let him go on this adventure, she didn't have belief that Naruto would make it back alive. Daring, either I go with you or you can try to take the amulet from me, either way I can promise you that I'm staying on the train. Naruto said with a bitter tone. Seriously, he beat her while he was still recovering from his fight with Nightmare Moon, and she beat that monkey cat hybrid, so technically speaking he was stronger than Ahuizitl. You should listen to him, because either you'll be on the ground knocked out or enjoying me telling Naruto about the summer sun celebration and how Fleetfoot did leading the group. Spitfire said as she wrapped her wing around Naruto affectionately. Daring mused the thought of attacking Naruto at that moment. It couldn't be too hard to get the amulet from him, but the action reeked of foreboding as the two talked amicably on each other. It was as if they were expecting her to try, which she was still considering. Even as they spoke amicably with each other, they still perceived her as a threat, and that brought a small sense of relief and mistrust to Daring as the train began moving. I'm going to check on the next cart. Naruto nodded as he watched her leave from the corner of his eye, still unsure on how to handle the situation, just knowing that the few days ahead was going to be rough for the unicorn. Even if he believed it was going to be a walk in the park, a small seed of doubt had been planted in his mind as he watched Daring hesitate on the subject of trying to taking it from him. Was there more to this amulet besides being a weapon than she was letting on? Whether it was the case or not, hopefully she wouldn't find out about the elements of harmony he brought with him, because he imagines that wouldn't be the only thing he'd have to watch out for if he did. Naruto took another small glance at his friend. He was partially glad she opted to tag along on the trip, sacrificing her vacation time to go with him. Spitfire might have been somewhat lax and joking at times, but he knew when things got rough that the mare was as strict and calculating as they came, even more so than a fire-wielding unicorn that threatened to burn him alive the next time she saw him. Next time we get off we're going to be in Rome, land of the sheep and tales of creatures of old. I'm now kind of glad that I barged in on you today. Spitfire grinned at the unicorn, the blonde nodding in response as the two readied themselves for the adventure ahead, one particularly keen on spending some quality time with the other, even if he didn't know it just yet. 5 days later, Rome. Daring waited alongside her two companions as they adjusted to the new surroundings. They had arrived late that night, and the two, despite how energetic they seemed, weren't night ponies as she once imagined. So it was decided instead of traversing the streets they'd rest in the nearest hotel, and they head towards the intended destination in the morning. Naruto thoroughly surprised her as he rented the nicest room in the building for the three of them to share, before claiming the couch for his own place to rest, falling asleep almost instantly after he made one clone. This almost surprised her as much as the fact that Naruto looked absolutely unharmed, except the small scorch mark still lingering on his coat. Spitfire flopped on the bed before groaning as she shuffled on it slightly before retreating to higher ground, sleeping contently amidst the hanging emerald gem chandelier, which honestly surprised the explorer as she approached the topic on mating, quite frequently eliciting a great blush from Naruto. Which meant the 4-star bed was reserved especially for her, which made Daring believe that these perhaps were the oddest set of ponies she'd ever met. They'd slept in rather late. It was close to lunch as she started to stir the first one up surprisingly. Her lone wings shook to get rid of any cramps that may have tried to form up on her. It was likely that the days ahead were going to be hectic, and her informant was going to be rather vocal if she were to hazard a small guess about her newest adventure. Her head craned as the small shift of the chandelier let Daring know that Spitfire was waking up. As she rolled out of the chandelier falling to the ground, the adventured winced as she closed her eyes, expecting the dull thud to echo in the room. A second later her eyes peeked open as she blinked at the Wonderbolt smacking her lips in the very spot standing upright, her wings folding back into place. Daring didn't want to imagine the amount of training that the Wonderbolt had to go through to right herself half asleep while falling to the ground. The golden-coated Pegasus swiftly headed to the shower, leaving the door open as the sound of the falling water and her atrocious singing filled the suite. It wasn't too long before Naruto got up. The biggest indication was that the clone would pop wistfully into nothing. She'd seen it happen often on the train to the city. She watched him smack his lips, heading to the bathroom disregarding it being in use. Her body slowly shuffled, curious as to the reaction of the duo to see how they'd react, seeing each other in such a provocative state. She knew the Wonderbolt approached the topic of mating with gusto, making innuendos whenever she seemed bored or thought it was appropriate for conversation at hand, which was never. Surprisingly enough, she didn't hear the rampant apologies from the blonde or possibly the invitation to join her, only the atrocious singing of the Wonderbolt she had diminishing respect for. It was a few minutes later before Naruto came out, his eyes relaxed as he sent a smile her way. She couldn't tell if it was genuine or not. Naruto was still an enigma to her, like a big mystery that was waiting to be unraveled. She'd mused that a small fondness was directed towards him because of the fact that she didn't know what to see him as. The level of mistrust was obvious between the two as he continuously made clones when he fell asleep, and Spitfire ventured away from the train for the occasional workout regarding her wings, but when he was awake his nature was full comfort and warmth that seemed to radiate off of him. It wasn't subtle, but she imagined the unicorn was anything but subtle at this point. Even this lavish room screamed look at me, his ridiculous healing factor, and the fact that he so casually got along with one of the biggest names in Equestria was something to look at in awe as well. Ering huffed as the Pegasus came barreling out of the shower, her mind obviously elsewhere as she slipped past him humming a tune that was probably off-key, if she recognized it. I see that everyone's awake and feeling refreshed I hope. The sarcasm wasn't lost on any pony, especially Spitfire as the tune slowly slipped from her mind, heading towards the door. Yep, I mean it might not have been a fancy bed or anything, but that chandelier had the sense that everything was right with the world. The Wanderbolt said with a smile as she took one last look at the both of them before leaving the room altogether. Naruto stood in silence, trying to find the right words to say as he holstered the saddlebags, the strap tightening as he readied himself for the day ahead. We'll be fine, just lead the way, and we'll stop anything that tries to threaten us. It was the easiest thing that came to Naruto's mind at the exact moment. He didn't know exactly how else to put it, but he was going to help her, that's all there was to it, and not a damn thing was going to stop him. Ering looked away as heat rose to her face in embarrassment and anger, neither overriding the other. Thanks, but that's not what I was going to ask, is the amulet secure? She said, her voice betraying her, as the confident tone she usually portrayed was now muffled by one of embarrassment, which heightened both feeling once again. Yeah, it's fine, right here with everything else I brought with me. He ignored the questioning stare as he fixed his saddlebags, the jangle still evident. We should get going. I know Spitfire isn't the most patient of ponies, I'd kind of feel sorry for the receptionist if we left her with him for too long. Ering nodded as the unicorn passed by her, rushing through the door leaving her alone to stew on what he said not just seconds ago. Stop everything that threatens us, I wish it were that simple, Ering said wistfully as she headed towards the door, resolving herself for the inevitable betrayal she'd do once the amulet was complete. Her magenta eyes focused on the hallway as Naruto stood propped against the hull, his head buried in the satchel as he looked into the bag, his muzzle buried deep into the bag. It was already settling in, something she hoped honestly to prevent from happening. What are you doing? She watched as he jumped, his bright blue eyes full of shock as he opened the said muzzle to think of something to say. I was just making sure the amulet was fine, yeah, because I saw some shifty goat pass by and stuff. Naruto said as his eyes shifted all over the place. Hopefully Ering didn't call him out because this was much harder to explain than it should be. Sure, come on, your friend's waiting for you. Her words were hollow as he quickly nodded, the both heading down the stairs in silence, the sight of a bored Wanderbolt making small talk with two Pegasi at the front desk. So you two are identical twins, huh? That's cool, so what's your names? Spitfire said as she placed her head on the reception desk. I'm Yin and she's Yang, we are identical twins, and we'd appreciate it if you actually removed your head from the counter. We like to run a clean business, and whether you're the Yin's words were stopped with a cold glare as her sister motioned towards the stairs. Thanks Celestia, you arrived. Naruto, I was getting bored out of my mind, these two here just wouldn't say anything at all. Spitfire said as she motioned towards the receptionist, glaring at her. It's Uzumaki's fault, he kept his nose buried in that saddlebag, so it took him forever to find the stairs. Ering said with a roll of their eyes as Naruto looked at her with a mixture of shock and caution. Let's just go already, I got the deposit back and I'm hoping we get to see something that'll make this trip worth it, besides the silent twins here. Spitfire said as she ushered her companions along, leaving the hotel for better things. The Huazitl stared lazily at the Drake before him. It was rather irritating watching his business partner chew on what he suspected was turquoise. Regardless, with each second that passed the noise seemingly got louder and louder, which irritated him to no end. He would receive the periodic reprieve as the Drake would swallow his food before the rattle and crunching would begin again. This had been happening for 2 continuous days, and if it wasn't for the ridiculous payday he was offered, he was sure that snapping this Drake's neck would already occurred, though he was going to do the task after he'd been paid. No annoyance was going to live that long, and especially if the item was worth this much to his boss complete, it would probably earn him another payday if he pushed it the right way. His musings of greed and betrayal slipped from his mind as knocking came from his door. The Huazitl made a small gesture for it to be opened as a tiger fumbled with the doorknob. After a few seconds the door opened to reveal a set of nearly identical Pegasus pony twins. Their manes draped over each of their left ears as cold violet eyes stared on at the occupants. The only notable difference was their cutie marks. Half a yin-yang symbol stood out on their cobalt blue coat. I see you've both returned with good news, I presume. Equestria smirked as he dropped his gaze towards the twins' hooves. Specks of block covered their front hooves as they entered the room, closing the door behind them. "We found her and she didn't bother hiding as you presumed she would, sir," the left one said with a dull tone, who Equestria deemed to call Yin. She wasn't alone either, there were two with her. The remaining sister Yang immediately spoke up, continuing the conversation. "One was a Wanderbolt, we confirmed that she was Spitfire." Yin looked on as she stared at her master, his anger was clearly evident at this point. "The other, we know his name, that's all, he's rather an unknown to us." Yang spoke up as she looked on at the shaking fist, ready to smash into her at any moment. "Speak it." The icy tone sent shivers down the twins' spines, but it commanded them all the same to comply. "Naruto Uzumaki." The twins shouted the name as they flinched, expecting another beating from their master. What they received was more chilling to the bone than any beating or punishment they received so far. The raucous laughter of their master's guest rang through the room. His scaly claws clapped with vigor as his laughter deepened, a canine or two protruding over his bottom lip as his eyes gleamed with what the two ponies suspected was madness. "Do you wish to share the source of your amusement, or do you wish to laugh like a lunatic?" Equestria barked out as the fire's eyes honed in on him. "I just find it rather appropriate that one of those ponies my master so vehemently wants disposed of is right here. It's as if the fate has decided to give me an extra prize for my diligence." The words were strangled as the Drake would break out into the occasional giggle during his tangent, eliciting a look of fear from some of the room's occupants. "Kill him and you can guarantee yourself a large substantial bonus, perhaps as big as your initial reward, if you bring me his severed head." The words formed a pit of unease in the monkey-cat hybrid stomach. Killing had become second nature to him at this point. He just massacred a small village not even a week ago, but this was different. Such a high reward for one head was ridiculous even by his standards. Why pay so much for one measly pony's head? One insignificant ant shouldn't pose a threat to your master. He worded it carefully as he had to know why he was such a high-value target, but without overtly getting himself tangled up more with this crazy Drake. Though there are plenty of reasons alone for him to be considered a threat in these past 3 years. So I hope you will eliminate him along with anything else you deem fit for the task at hand. Another nuisance to add to the list, alongside a Wanderbolt and Daring Do, tell everyone involved that when they spring the trap, make sure you push them in the water, I can handle the rest. Equestria said as the twins nodded in agreement, leaving once again to fulfill their task. It would only be a matter of moments before they'd fall in battle. Once they fell into the river, it'd be all over. The stagnant smell of dust and aged paper filled the air in a small shop. A velvet-coated Pegasus brushed her wings over the shelves, wiping dust off the collection of tomes that hadn't been touched in ages. Though she detested the simple request from her husband as he buried himself in his research, the unicorn never knew when to stop when it came to ponies pulling favors from him, especially if it involved that mare, but she had the smallest of soft spot for her as well. This favor, however, he was mutually interested in, so it was doubly effective in motivating him. Too bad it wasn't effective on other important matters, his loving family mostly. Her eyes draped over another shelf as the doorbell rang. She needn't bother looking down as a 5-year-old Pegasus filly came dashing through the store. Her voice a myriad of cheers as she shifted up towards her clumsily. The small feat was impressive enough, but the small gleam her daughter had in her eye meant that her little filly had a secret to share. "Mommy," her words were barely audible over the door being opened. An all too familiar sight filled her caramel eyes as Daring Do walked through the doorway. No wonder why her filly was so excited. A smile crept on her face as the filly dive-bombed the famed explorer, sending her to the ground as the older pony showered her with what she supposed was more affection, considering how happy she was just moments ago. Her eyes blinked a second time as 2 other ponies walked in. She instantly recognized both of them, Naruto Uzumaki, who she was very particularly fond of for certain reasons, and Spitfire, the current captain of the Wanderbolts, stood in wonder as they watched the scene unfold in front of them. The mother pursed her lips at the quick thought of Daring seeking assistance. It was quickly dismissed as fast as the thought formed. She knew Daring has been initially a loner, taking on her pursuits without no aid. It took coaxing from her and her husband to establish that Daring couldn't do everything on her own. She honestly believed that the mare knew it, but didn't have the mind to care, believing the good she did outweighed any other outcome. "Welcome to our humble shop," she said sweetly as the trio and her daughter turned her attention towards the Pegasus. "I believe introductions are in order. You may call me Quick Quill or Q if you feel like it." The words were soft as the three slowly relaxed as a gesture from the Pegasus got the filly to close the door. "My husband will be out shortly. I'm sure he knows you 3 are already here." Daring smiled as the Pegasus floated down towards her. It was warming to know that she was still regarded with such trust, despite prior warnings on her adventures. Even the filly's gestures made Daring feel the slightest bit lighter, knowing that she was somewhere safer, lifted a burden off her. She just wished this sense of content could fix her wings, because she imagined things would be different right now. It's good to see you Q, and I've seen little Hazel has grown since the last time I saw her. She cooed the words as her lone wing rubbed the filly's head affectionately. These are my co-workers Naruto Uzumaki and Spitfire, captain of the Wanderbolts. The words felt heavy as she said them like it didn't have the weight she wanted them to have as she tried to lie to probably the nicest mare that she had ever grew accustomed to and her 5-year-old daughter. Co-workers, lies you're about as social as your parents and grumpier than both of them combines, so if you're going to lie to Hazel, do it about something less irrelevant. The words struck through the bookstore as Hazel left her side making her way towards the owner of the voice. The smell of mint and oranges filled the air as a unicorn stepped forward, his navy blue coat a mess as the black and white mane hung over his striking scarlet-red eyes. Here he was the stallion of the hour and one of the only ponies that cared about as much for the happening in the world, Crescent Lulamoon. Dear, I think it's going to take a while, do you think you could take out Hazel for a bit? I'm sure you both could do with some fresh air. The way he said Daring knew it wasn't a suggestion, and she was sure that Q picked up on it as she ushered the filly out, leaving the four alone. Daring blinked in surprise as she watched cards come to life, pouring from the bookshelves as they hovered dangerously in the air with a sunny yellow hue, her companions immediately on edge as they prepared themselves for a fight. What are you doing? Even if it was a lie they still are on our side, Crescent. The words were full of confusion as the massive card swirled above them. I know that, but I don't know where to start with my findings on the amulet. I'm sure you know a great deal about the subject Daring considering the circumstances, but I've only had no more than say a week dealing with this particular subject. Crescent said with a smile as he gestured towards the cards that slowly began to merge into a tangible shape, more specifically a book. Naruto stared at the card manipulating unicorn, he'd met this unicorn before, he just wasn't where. We've met before haven't we? The question was simple enough, and his suspicions were confirmed as the older unicorn gave an appreciative nod towards him. Yes, I believe it was in Prance, I was dealing with a few gargoyles or something of that sort. I exhausted myself, you came to my rescue and promptly defeated them with only but one attack, it was an extraordinary one too, if it didn't deal such grievous wounds to you afterwards. The words were surprisingly calm as the unicorn set the book of cards on the ground. The Alicorn amulet is essentially a tool that's existed longer than Equestria was founded. If I was a betting stallion, and I am, it's likely that this was one of the reasons that a huge rift was created between the three pony tribes. Crescent smiled as the Pegasus dipped her head closer, digging through the information being shared, sifting through what she knew and what she didn't. So what's so evil about it? Spitfire said as she peered over the enthralled Pegasus, a picture clearly now on the page. It was of a crazed-looking earth pony being burnt at the stake, a familiar-looking necklace wrapped around its neck as menacing red eyes stared at the crowd. As you can see by the picture, it corrupts those that dare to wear it. All tribes of pony kind are affected by the whispers of power that come from it, even holding a piece of it causes this decent, so I caution you all to be wary of it, it's ruined many of lives already. He could see Daring do bite her cheek before turning away, settling her gaze back on Naruto. There's 3 pieces that go to each tribe, the large gem that is the centerpiece for the amulet amplifies earth pony magic. The smallest gem for unicorns, which all of you guesses amplifies their magical abilities, and the last piece which binds it all together is meant for Pegasi. So say we give it to a dragon, what then? Naruto asked, wondering if the amulet could help with his summoning. Absolutely nothing, it's meant to amplify pony's inner magic only, so it'd be just another trinket for its collection. Which goes for the individual tribes too, if a Pegasus held a piece that amplifies their natural magic, it'd be nothing more than a decorative piece, but I'm sure at some point being around it will compel you to complete it. The card-using unicorn said as he locked eyes with Daring. Where's the next piece? We need to get it, Daring said as she resolved herself for the events ahead. Oh, the next piece should be in the Tiber River, on the bottom of it glowing. Crescent said, staring wistfully at the book as Daring and Spitfire nodded in understanding, one slightly more excited about the prospect than the other. I'd advise heading to the Pons Fabricius, it's the oldest bridge around Rome. His eyes traipsed over Daring as she nodded in understanding. I'm sure you're aware of this, but you're being watched, and you, my dear injured Pegasus, know who it is, so keep your destruction to a minimum. The unicorn said as he ushered the ponies out of his house, trying to rid himself of the sense of dread as he took one glance at Naruto's right saddlebag. The feeling of power that emanated off it was enticing, so it made sense that what Naruto had was obviously the Pegasus portion, or they'd all be a mess at the moment, or half of every pony present at least. So it was a phenomenal effort that Naruto was willingly repelling the whispers of power that it promised him. That unicorn was something before, but now he didn't know how to measure him as an average unicorn. Equestria certainly has gotten more interesting since I've met you, Naruto. Chapter end. Alright, that's it for today's video guys, let me know in the comments section how was the story, and also don't forget to like, share and subscribe. I will meet you in another video, peace out.